ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hey, if I say UFOs, I reckon you've got some thoughts on that, right? I'm Danny O'Neill, host of the latest season of the Expanse podcast, Uncropped, which is all about that very divisive topic. It's one that takes us to far north Queensland, where one farmer saw something he couldn't explain, something that would go on to define his life and divide the world around him. What really happened? And who do you believe when everyone brings their own version of the truth to the table? Search Expanse on the ABC Listen app.
I will be a Prime Minister who restores the dream of home ownership. The Albanese government has made the housing crisis much worse over the last few years.
Under Labor, there will be more homes and smaller deposits. Under Peter Dutton, there will be fewer homes and higher prices.
This week, Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton unveiled big new policies that are supposed to make it easier for young Australians to buy their first home. But will they really help?
A coalition government will allow you to deduct interest payments on the first $650,000 of a mortgage.
That under a Labor government, you'll be able to buy your first home with just a 5% deposit.
We will reduce net overseas migration and will free up 100,000 homes in 5 years.
We are asking for the opportunity to keep building, to reward your hard work.
Recently, we brought you our Housing Hostages series with our business editor, Michael Janda, all about the housing crisis, how we landed in it and how we get out of it. Today, he's back to explain the new policies and what they'd actually do to the housing market. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Michael, in our Housing Hostages series last month, we lamented that no major party was taking significant action to address the housing crisis. Well, of course, this week we have had announcements from both the Coalition and Labor that they say are going to help people who want to buy their own home. So, should we be cheering?
I think it's too early to break out the champagne,
Okay.
Sam.
Oh, what a shame.
Neither of these policies are going to help people who otherwise couldn't get into the housing market at some point in their lives to break in. They're really the kind of policies that help people who already would have been likely to end up in their own home, maybe get there a few years earlier.
Well, let's then unpack these policies a bit more. Let's start with the Coalition and this idea to use the interest on our mortgage payments as a tax deduction. This is only, of course, for first home buyers purchasing newly constructed homes. But it sounds pretty appealing.
Yeah, so on the face of it, it is a potentially big saving. I think the estimates are that it will be more than $50,000 in interest saved for the average buyer who could take up this scheme. So if you're a higher income earner, and it is capped at up to $175,000 for singles and $250,000 for couples, but if you're closer to the top of that threshold than the bottom, you will save more because, of course, your average tax rate is higher the higher your income is. It's limited to interest paid on the first $650,000 of the mortgage, so I guess that's the way of capping it from, overly benefiting people who can afford more expensive homes.
Yeah, okay, so it's about a $50,000 saving. That's a lot of money over 5 years. Peter Dutton, he's been out, of course, at various building sites, which politicians like to do during election campaigns, with his son Harry spruiking this policy.
I am saving up for a house, and so is my sister Beck, and a lot of my mates, but as you've probably heard, it's almost impossible to get in.
So Peter Dutton was trying to make the point here that even members of his own family are having trouble getting into the housing market, I suppose.
Yeah, and whether that's the best example, though, because as we know, our federal politicians are not exactly typical income earners. They're much above the average. You know, the Dutton family also has business and property interests that mean that even more so than most politicians, Peter Dutton's family is well above average in terms of income and wealth. Of course, Peter Dutton made the point quite rightly that, you know, young people shouldn't have to rely on their parents having wealth to get them into the housing market. And that is a very valid point. But at 20 years of age, I think most people would say it's still a bit too early for Harry to really credibly come out and say that he's facing the prospect of being locked out of the housing market when you have many people in their 30s and even beyond who haven't been able to break in.
And I think our households are no different to many households where we want our kids to work hard, to save, and we'll help them with a deposit at some stage. But in many families, in a lot of families, most families across the country, they haven't got that luxury.
Okay, so let's leave that there. There is also another coalition policy which will allow some people to tap into their super for a deposit to buy a home. So tell me about that.
Yeah, so this was announced late last year, and the coalition has pledged to allow first home buyers to access up to either 40% of their super balance or $50,000 as a cap, whichever is the lower, for their home deposit.
That allows home ownership earlier. And as the asset grows in value, as your home grows in value, so does your ultimate asset position as you grow older, and you put that money back into super when you dispose of that house. You can end up with a house and a good super balance as well.
So you have to repay the money back into your super when you eventually sell that home, though, so that's a catch in the scheme. The coalition also promised $5 billion to improve infrastructure to, get sites ready for development, basically grants to states and local governments to get more development sites, and also provide more incentives for businesses to train apprentices to get more construction workers on the tools. And that's also something we've seen from the Labor side as well, to try and address these skill shortages. And both major parties have made noises about reducing the migration intake. Obviously, having less population increase will put less pressure on the physical demand for housing.
All right. Okay, Michael, let's now turn to Labor. It's proposing to let first home buyers to purchase a home with a very small 5% deposit. So tell me what they're doing there.
Yeah, so typically you need a 20% deposit to buy a house in order to avoid lender's mortgage insurance, which protects the bank, not you, if you default on your mortgage.
This is a generational change that will empower a new generation of first home buyers. In every city and region, this will make home ownership easier. It will take years off the time it takes to get together a deposit.
Currently, it's an average of more than 5.5 years across the country for first home buyers to save that 20% deposit. The biggest catch with this scheme is that you still need to be able to afford the repayments, and the smaller your deposit, the bigger the loan you need to buy that home, and the bigger your repayments will be.
Yeah, exactly. Once you've got the loan, the reality might hit quite hard. Okay, so the government is also finding another $10 billion in the budget to build homes just for first home buyers. Yeah,
Labor's promised to spend this $10 billion to build 100,000 new homes that would only be available to first home buyers. Of this, $2 billion would be grants and $8 billion in zero interest loans or investments in these new homes, mostly going through states and territories. And the idea is that particularly states, territories and the Commonwealth have land that's underutilised or unutilised that could be freed up for housing. And the hope is that these houses would be cheaper than what's available in the private sector, but it will take years to get to this 100,000 target, potentially 8 years. The Housing Australia Future Fund was set up in this term of Parliament under the Labor government to fund the construction of social and affordable housing. It's a $10 billion fund, but not many homes have yet been built, and the aim to build 30,000 social and affordable homes over 5 years is really just tickling the sides of the massive waiting list for public, social and other affordable housing.
Okay. All right. So they're the policies. So what is your verdict then, Michael? You are an expert in this field, in housing. So do either party's plans actually make it better for young people trying to buy their first home?
You'd have to say overall, not much.
Okay.
They're really fiddling around the edges, even though it sounds like there's a lot of money involved. You know, to be fair to both major parties, they are trying to direct some of these subsidies and tax breaks to new building. That's an improvement on some of the first home buyers grants that we've seen from both major parties in the past. But fundamentally, there's still more going to the demand side than to the supply side. So if you take the coalition scheme, for example, think about this, Sam. If developers know the average buyer has an extra $50,000 or so worth of government tax deductions to play with, what do you think is going to happen to the average price of a new build home?
I think I can guess.
Yeah, it's probably going to go up by, let's say $50,000.
Yes.
And that's how the market works when there is an undersupply, because people will be scrambling over themselves to find a new build to buy so that they can get this tax deduction. Well, there are only so many new builds out there. You know, Chris Richardson, for example, a well-known budget watcher for many decades, has called these dumb policies.
All right, so the economists aren't so impressed. But if you had to pick one of these parties' policies, which one is actually better in the end? Or are they just both completely going down the wrong path?
I think both have missed opportunities to tackle the other side of the equation, which is demand, and demand from people who are not planning to live in the home but planning to invest in it, or planning to have a second home that they underutilise. Because there is a lot of underutilised housing in Australia. Stamp duty is a massive problem. Every economist, they will tell you if you could get rid of stamp duty and replace it with a land tax, you'd have a much more efficient allocation of housing, because the incentives would be flipped. People who had too much land and too big houses would be incentivised to sell to reduce their tax bill, freeing up houses for, young families who need more space. But no one wants to touch that because it's a big tax change. If I have to look at the two policy proposals as a whole on offer, I think the biggest advantage the Labor policy has is a focus on direct supply. Now, the coalition policy, on the other hand, creates incentives that may also end up in more new homes being built. But as most economists have pointed out, it does tend to benefit those who are already more likely to one day be able to afford to buy a home anyway, which is also what the low deposit scheme from Labor does. There is a lot of analysis from economists saying that the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing, reducing them wouldn't reduce property prices by much. But even if it was just a couple of percent, that would be useful. And unlike these schemes, it would raise revenue for the federal budget, which could, for instance, be put into topping up the Housing Australia Future Fund and building more social housing and increasing supply. It really comes down to the experience of Bill Shorten in the 2019 election. I think certainly Labor, which might consider these policies, has very much shelved them on the basis of losing what was seen as an unlosable election, on the back, in large part, of their plans to dial back negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount.
All right, so your verdict is do not break out the champagne. These policies will not end the housing crisis.
It's a start, and it's good that the two major parties have put a focus on housing. Eventually, someone is going to have to do something serious about these problems. I just don't think these policies are quite there yet.
And Michael, in the meantime, while we're waiting, what happens?
house prices probably just keep going up, especially if the Reserve Bank, as expected by most people in the market, cuts interest rates 4 or 5 times over the next year. It's pretty hard to see house prices going in any other direction, and that just makes affordability worse.
Michael Janda is the ABC's business editor. If you missed our 5-part Housing Hostages series, you can find it on the ABC Listen app. And for a wrap and analysis of last night's leaders' debate on the ABC, go over to Politics Now with Patricia Carvelis. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed and Adair Shepherd. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.